The JSON format is not strictly a Node.js topic, but you'll need to be familiar with it in order to move forward with Node.js. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. The original specification was popularized by Douglas Crockford in 2001, though the convention of sending serialized JavaScript objects dates back earlier than that. It's a data exchange format, kind of like XML, but with notable differences that make it not a one-to-one comparison. Because it fundamentally uses JavaScript as a data structure, it is natively parsable in JavaScript, and due to its simplicity, most popular programming languages today support serialization and deserialization methods natively. At its core, JSON is just a JavaScript object literal or an array with a slightly stricter convention. Here's an example JSON object. All of these properties are custom. There is no mandatory properties in JSON. JSON data structures can support most of the same basic data types JavaScript can, including numbers, strings, booleans, nulls, arrays, and objects. Any other data type is not supported. There are no functions in JSON, as JSON is simply a data exchange format, not a dynamic script. There's also no support for undefined values. Data can explicitly be defined to not exist with the null, but undefined suggests the value is implicitly not defined. There are other restrictions between JSON and traditional JavaScript objects. For example, JSON strings must be defined with double quotes. Single quotes or backticks are not allowed. Also, all JSON properties need to have quotes around them. Now that we have a JSON file, let's move on to parsing it inside a Node.js script. First, I'll paste the JSON object directly in the script to show that it is in fact valid JavaScript syntax. My stack analysis tool doesn't like that double quotes are being used, but it's not really an error. You can see that it's parsed like any object. You can access properties and array elements the same way you would any other JavaScript object. You typically won't include raw JSON data in your script files, though. Instead, you'll get data from a network request, or in our case, from a separate local file. One way to load JSON files in Node.js is to use the require statement. It works similarly to loading a global module like path or fs. Just pass a local path to the JSON file, and the function returns a JSON object. You use a dot and / to specify a relative path regardless of whether you're on a Windows OS or not. Besides its simplicity, the power in the JSON format is that it can be serialized or converted into a universal format that is easily transmitted or stored, and then deserialized, converted back into a format the target system can work with. For example, JSON data may come from a network request and needs to be parsed in a browser to update the page in some way. JSON.stringify converts a JavaScript or JSON object into a string of characters. This data can then be safely sent to a file or transmitted over a network request. The argument passed in does not need to be a JSON object. Any object or array that does not have a circular reference, properties that reference parent properties, can be serialized, though any undefined or function properties will be discarded. Here's an example of a JavaScript object being serialized. Notice that the resulting output does not include the function. Stringify automatically removes it. Here's an example of a circular reference to show that stringify function will fail. The stringify function also includes optional parameters to tailor the output. The replacer function can be used to replace particular properties when generating output. It's called for each property being parsed, and is expected to return a result. For example, you can make all string properties return in all caps, like this. The typeOf operator returns the string representation of the specified data type. For strings, that's the string string. It's unlikely that you'll be using the replacer function much, but the next optional argument does show up more often, the space argument. By default, json.stringify will squish everything onto one line, which is optimal for storage and data transfer. However, it's harder for humans to read. The space argument allows indenting each line of the resulting JSON string with spaces or custom characters. I most often use a numeric argument to specify that I want the output to include 2 spaces after each property. I typically leave the replacer argument null since I don't use it. Another uncommon capability of json.stringify is the option to define how to generate the JSON output inside the object itself. If an object defines a toJSON function, json.stringify will convert the output of that into a serialized JSON, as opposed to the object itself. Here's an example of how to add an additional property to the output. So we went over how to load JSON files in NodeJS and convert JSON or JavaScript objects into serialized strings. To convert the string back into a JavaScript object, use the json.parse function. As long as the string argument passed in is still valid JSON or a JSON object or an array, a JavaScript object or array will be returned. Otherwise, an error is thrown. json.parse also has an optional argument called the reviver. It's similar to the replacer in the json.stringify function. It is called for each property of parsed data and allows the developer to transform the result. For example, all of the characters in strings can be made into lowercase like this. Like the replacer function, it's rare to see this in the wild though. So, we went over what JSON is, and how it can be serialized and deserialized in Node.js and the browser. Let me restate that JSON is not exclusively for Node.js or even JavaScript. It's an extremely common format that you'll see in many other languages. Knowing how the JSON data format works will allow us to create Node.js packages and utilize the Node Package Manager, which we'll get into next.